All right, the first category of biomolecules that we are going to discuss is carbohydrates. From this chapter, you should be able to summarize the basic chemical properties of a carbohydrate, state the roles of carbohydrates in human physiology, and then compare the structure of simple and complex carbohydrates while also explaining the importance of fiber in the diet. So when we're talking about these carbohydrates tend to be best known for their ability to store energy. However, they also serve a very important role in the structure of many organisms. So here we have pictured a cactus. Cactuses is a plant. Plants use cellulose in their cell walls to give them structure and rigidity even when water is scarce. Crab is also pictured here because their hard outer shells are made of another carbohydrate known as chitin. Bacterial cells also produce a very thick carbohydrate shell made out of peptidoglycan. So all of these are sort of structural uses for carbohydrates. Carbohydrates contain a carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in a 1:2 to 1 ratio, meaning that for every carbon, there is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Thus, the ratio is going to be carbon and 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. In other words, a carbon and a water molecule. This is where the term carbohydrate comes from. It literally means carbon water, and it makes sense when you look at that structure in that 1:2 to 1 ratio. Again, I'm not going to quiz you on that. I just think it's beneficial for me to know that. It's helpful to help me remember things, and so I like to share the etymology of words with you, mostly because I find that as a very useful study tool. But it's not something I'm ever going to quiz you over. So, monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are going to be the structural subunit of a carbohydrate. So the monosaccharide is going to be the monomer subunit for a carbohydrate. It's also going to be known as a simple sugar. Monosaccharides can have a carbon backbone of 3 to 7 carbons. What we're showing here is a molecule of glucose, which is a hexose. It's a 6-membered carbon ring, and this is going to be the major source of cellular fuel for all living organisms. So, there you go. It has a backbone of 3 to 7 carbons. Glucose is going to be the most common and immediate energy source in the body. Disaccharides. Disaccharides are also simple sugars, but they're made up of 2 monomer subunits. This is going to be made of 2 monosaccharides joined together through a dehydration reaction. Many examples of disaccharides exist in our everyday experience. So, for example, lactose, milk sugar, is going to be composed of galactose and glucose. Lactose intolerant individuals lack the enzyme lactase, which breaks down lactose into galactose and glucose. Sucrose is table sugar. Sucrose is composed of glucose and fructose. Maltose is going to be comprised of 2 glucose molecules. So there are a lot of different types of disaccharides. That disaccharide simply means 2. That di meaning 2, and that saccharide refers to the carbohydrate. So here's how we synthesize and break down a disaccharide. Here we have 2 glucose molecules. We're going to be making maltose. And the way that we are going to bring them together is through a dehydration reaction. In a dehydration reaction, we're going to strip off the hydroxide ion here and a hydrogen ion from here. What we're going to end up with is an oxygen that is covalently bonded between the 2 glucose molecules to form a single molecule of maltose and a molecule of water off to the side. So that's, if we drive this reaction forward, we have a dehydration reaction. You can also see that there is an arrow here indicating that this reaction can go in reverse. In other words, water plus maltose equals 2 glucose molecules. Glucose plus glucose, dehydrate it, we get maltose plus water. Water plus maltose equals 2 glucose molecules. So like I said, monomers are going to be the monosaccharide, or the monomer of carbohydrates is monosaccharides. Polysaccharides are going to be the polymer form of carbohydrates. So this is going to be made up of long chains of monosaccharides all linked together. Now, because of their length and their size, they're often going to be referred to as complex carbohydrates. They're going to serve the very useful purpose of short-term energy storage. When energy is needed in an organism, only has to break down this large complex carbohydrate into smaller sugar molecules, or those individual monosaccharides. The polymer chains are going to be, during the process of energy storage, these polymer chains are going to be wound into a tight helical formation. And this is going to serve two purposes. One, it conserves space. It's going to conserve space, but it's also going to, because they're wound around each other, it's going to leave those sugar links exposed to hydrolytic enzymes for easy access to those sugar molecules. So that way, if we need them, we can easily snip off and break down those glucose molecules whenever we need them. Plants are going to store their energy in the form of starch, and there are two forms of starch. There's a branched starch and an unbranched starch, amylopectin and amylose. Animals, on the other hand, are going to store their glucose in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is a carbohydrate. It's produced by animals, and it's stored in the liver. The release of this sugar in the form of glycogen is ultimately going to be regulated by hormones. That's going to help control the release and the uptake of carbohydrates and sugar into the bloodstream. Polysaccharides are ideal for energy storage because they are not soluble in water and they are much larger than a simple sugar, so they do not easily pass out of the cell. It makes them very easy to contain and store. Polysaccharides, like I said, are going to be made of those complex carbohydrates made of long polymers of glucose subunits, and they're going to serve a lot of different purposes. I would like you to know the different forms of complex carbohydrates and their purposes. So I would like you to know that starch is used for energy storage in plants. Glycogen is used for energy storage in animals. Cellulose is a structural carbohydrate, cannot be used for energy. It's a structural, and it's found inside of plant walls. It's found inside of plant walls. Since it cannot be digested, it cannot be used or broken down for energy, this is what we refer to as digestive fiber. Can't digest it, but it's still a very important part of our diet. This helps keep us regular and keeps things moving through our digestive system. And so that would be cellulose, or plant carbohydrate that cannot be broken down. Chitin is also a structural carbohydrate. It's going to be found in the cell walls of funguses and also in the exoskeleton of some animals. Peptidoglycan is also a structural carbohydrate. It's going to be found in bacterial walls. All right, and that's it for carbohydrates. You should be able to explain the differences between monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides and give an example of each. I would also like you to describe the difference in structure between simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates and explain. We talked a little bit about how some complex carbohydrates can be used for energies and others cannot. Your textbook goes into greater detail about the differences between those. I would really like you to know this slide, though, in particular. I would like you to know the different types of carbohydrates listed here, whether they are found in plants, animals, bacteria, or funguses, and then what they are specifically used for. So that's it for the section on carbohydrates.